We're here this evening to discuss free market solutions in health, prohibition or harm reduction, on the back of the research that we released just last week on free market solutions in health, the case of nicotine. Of course, nicotine and tobacco control was heavily in the news just at the end of last week, with the UK government deciding to postpone any decision to press ahead with the plain packaging of tobacco products. But with the European Union Tobacco Products Directive, it remains very much on the agenda, not just plain packaging, but other elements of tobacco control. And we have assembled a fantastic panel for you this evening to put forward their eclectic views on how we should tackle these sort of health problems. Our first speaker on my immediate left is Christopher Snowden. He's the Director of Lifestyle Economics here at the IEA, a new unit focusing on controversial products and services that we established in January this year and formally launched in May. He's the author of The Art of Suppression, The Spirit Level Delusion, and Velvet Glove, Iron Fist, which is also the name of his personal blog site. His work focuses on pleasure, prohibition and dodgy statistics, he claims. He's authored a number of publications here for the IEA, including Sock Puppets, Euro Puppets, The Proof of the Pudding, The Crack Cocaine of Gambling, and most recently, which I've referred to, Free Market Solutions in Health. Our second speaker is Dr. Axel Klein, the editor of Drugs and Alcohol Today, which I mentioned copies are available for you here. He is a lecturer of anthropology of conflict, criminal justice and policy at the University of Kent. He is a trained social anthropologist working for both the charity sector and intergovernmental agencies in different national and international settings. Dr. Klein is particularly interested in how the legislative and political framework has been set to control aspects of human behaviour when it comes to drugs and alcohol. Our third speaker is Clive Bates. Clive is currently an independent consultant with a wealth of policy experience both domestically and internationally. He was previously the director of Counterfactual, a public interest consultancy and analytical advocacy organisation which focused on energy, environment, public health and international development. He's worked for the Department of Energy and Climate Change as a special advisor and was Director General at the Sustainable Futures in Wales and was previously the Director of ASH. Our fourth speaker is Katherine Devlin. She is the president of the Electronic Cigarette Industry Trade Association, which represents the e-cig industry and consumers at both UK and EU level. She is a strong advocate for harm reduction and has vigorously opposed medicinal regulation of e-cigarettes by MHRA and by the European Commission. And last but no means least, Rebecca Taylor, our final speaker, is the Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament for Yorkshire and Humber. She has more than 10 years' experience in health, including working with patients to help improve NHS services, conducting health policy research, and helping health sector organisations with their communications. Rebecca is currently completing a part-time master's degree in public health as well. Please join me in welcoming your panel this evening.
I see it as my role here today to speak very briefly about the report that came out last week and give you a very basic overview of what's going on in the nicotine market. The thesis of the paper really is that it often seems that free market solutions don't exist in public health, and that you can only really make people healthier by banning things or taxing things or driving them into the black market. And I'm arguing here that that is not the case, and that actually there are free market solutions even in an issue such as smoking, and in fact that there already are at least two free market solutions, and there may well be more as we go through the 21st century. One of the parts of this report which I enjoyed writing the most, using my sort of background in history, is looking at the ways and means that the tobacco industry tried to develop a safer cigarette from the 1950s onwards, once the evidence of the link between smoking and lung cancer became proven beyond any reasonable doubt. What you saw after the initial studies on lung cancer and later on heart disease and other diseases is that the tobacco industry attempted to modify the product and make it safer, and indeed there were some, including in government, who thought that cigarettes could actually be made safe or as near as safe as people would probably be able to tolerate. At the same time, the public health groups and the anti-smoking groups essentially began a course to drive cigarettes out from society, up to and including prohibition. The attempt to make a safer cigarette failed. There were some interesting avenues of research, but the industry was unable to make smoked tobacco almost by definition, was unable to make it safe or find a tolerable risk. The anti-smoking movement had many successes in terms of educating people and denormalising the products, but I do argue in this paper that in many countries, including the UK and Ireland, that anti-smoking measures are yielding diminishing returns. The recent controversy about plain packaging and the display bans that we've had, the graphic warnings, are really all just an acceleration of one of the things that without a doubt did work in the 1960s and 70s, which is putting a warning on cigarettes, telling people that these things might kill. However, I think making the warnings bigger or more graphic or taking up the entire pack is having less and less effect, and indeed can be counterproductive. And I'm arguing that there is a third way. The tobacco industry failed to make a safe cigarette, but at the turn of the century, two events. One in China, some pharmacist in China designed the electronic cigarette. In Sweden, where they've been using a smokeless tobacco product called snus for 200 years, evidence started coming out, that it did not, as was originally suspected, cause mouth cancer, but it did in fact have a very significant effect on the number of people who were smoking. People were switching from cigarettes to snus at a phenomenal rate. What was the response of government to these two developments? They tried to ban them, or they did ban them. Snus is banned in the EU everywhere apart from Sweden. E-cigarettes are banned in a significant and unfortunately growing number of countries around the world. The e-cigarette has recently been, the MHRA in Britain and the European Commission have recently said they're going to regulate e-cigarettes as medicinal products. The danger with this is that we've had a free market solution in the shape of e-cigarettes, possibly not 100% safe, but nothing in life is 100% safe. We've walked through cancer-giving sunlight to be here today. Somebody may have a bomb about their person. Nothing is 100% safe, but we know without a shadow of a doubt they are vastly safer than cigarettes, and yet moves are afoot to make them less available than conventional cigarettes. I think that this is insane. My view about this is very straightforward. Medical regulation is for medical products. The EU's Tobacco Products Directive should apply only to tobacco products, and that we have potentially some free market solutions to the smoking problem and to reducing the number of smokers that do not require a penny of government money. They do not require any infringement on people's liberties, and they almost certainly will have a significant effect on the health of millions of people in the UK and Europe. They are being opposed by a number of different interests, including the pharmaceutical industry and the tobacco industry, by people in public health who can never see free markets and freedom as being a solution. I attribute it also to public ignorance, including a large number of doctors who think that nicotine causes cancer or causes other diseases, and to a moral puritanism. People not wanting to see nicotine as what it is, which is actually quite a mild recreational drug, which is much more similar to something like caffeine than it is to opium. But none of these interest groups should have should play the decisive role when making public health policy. We have, and we're very fortunate to have, a couple of products which there is growing evidence to show that smokers find them appealing substitutes for smoking, with all the public health benefits that entails, and all we really need is for the government to back off. Unfortunately, governments often feel the need to weigh in rather than back off, and that is what needs to change. It's bad for liberty, but it's also profoundly unhealthy. Thank you.
I come very much from a position of drug control and drug policy reform particularly. And when I first became familiar or became introduced to tobacco control issues, I saw lots of similarities. You had groups of academics and non-governmental organizations campaigning away with a sense of social justice and a sense of trying to reform, trying to promote a reform agenda. And there was also the sense of great asymmetry of power between the reformers and the campaigners on the one hand and the beast they were fighting, and that sort of sense of moral virtue, of being dragon slayers fighting a corrupt enemy. Yet there were real serious differences which I'd just like to highlight, and of which I think quite important to grasp. And the first one revolves around the role of the state. Tobacco control reformers want the state to take on a bigger role. They see the problem as being created by markets and civil society, something that needs to be corrected by collective action through state authorities, with a direct infringement on civil liberties. In drug policy reform, we want the state to get out. We think many of the problems that we're facing in drug control, with drug issues, but with much wider, which had a much wider ripple effect, are a direct consequence of the state getting involved in drug control. The second argument, or the second point of difference, lies in the kind of moral reasoning that is involved. And moral reasoning is important because I think it motivates many of the campaigners. Both groups are fighting for the greater good, though arguably there's also a lot of self-interest. When talking about the other side, tobacco control advocates will always talk about moral profit or corrupt profit, immoral profit rather, and the corruption that's involved. Drug policy reformers will talk about the vested interests in the drug control establishment. But when it comes to the actual argument for control, it is with tobacco control, the argument lies in the nature of tobacco and the nature of cigarettes particularly as a vehicle of nicotine delivery that's deadly, and tobacco being the single greatest cause of preventable death globally and so on. So banning tobacco, banning cigarettes, controlling tobacco is the right thing in itself. It's what we call an ontological argument. Whereas when it comes to drug policy, the arguments about health and so is almost secondary. An interesting discussion indeed, as is the discussion about the moral right to get high or low or stoned or whatever. Is it a good thing? Is it a right thing? All of that is secondary. The key thing is about that the consequences, the unintended consequences of drug control have outweighed all the good. So it's consequentialist moral reasoning. And with that, of course, comes the discussion about where are we traveling towards, what is the so-called end game. When it comes to drug policy reform, we're thinking of regulated markets that provide access to cannabis and coca and opiates and so on in various forms. And this is what we want to travel towards. And we're looking for a modification in government policies that mitigates the punitive and financial burden on the users and allows the government to sort of lay off. Tobacco control, I think the end game is the various sort of objectives. One is reducing the number of tobacco-related deaths. Second would be reducing or eliminating cigarettes. Thirdly, eliminating tobacco products. And fourthly, and this keeps cropping up, destroying the tobacco industry. And to that they want to modify the behavior of governments in order to increase the punitive and financial burden on the end group, the smokers. And this is a sort of an interesting difference also in the attitude towards drugs. And what's happened with tobacco control is this radical drift that reminds us of what happened to the alcohol control movement in the 19th century. When the temperance movement started off, it was about tempering alcoholic consumption in the early 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, the Salvation Army and all these other groups are teetotalists. They think there is no such thing as moderation. The idea of moderation is a myth, is one of the slogans we end up with. So the problem lies in the substance itself, in this case tobacco, and what we need to do, we need to stigmatize the product and the user. The user needs to be stigmatized and the habit denormalized. When it comes to drugs, of course, there's a completely different direction of travel once again, and we have it with this sort of harm reduction movement. Whereby the idea is that we have got a whole range of deleterious social problems or consequences arising from drug use, but they are not inherent to the substance itself, but to the political context and the social context under which the substance is used. There's no reason, for instance, for there being any drug-related death or organized crime groups being involved in the supply of opium or cannabis any more than there should be organised crime groups supplying bananas or peanuts or tobacco for that matter. It is something where there is on the one hand a capitalist economy with a demand and a government prohibition, and it's these elements that develop the dynamic of criminalisation, organised crime, and with it the corruption and so on that goes with it. But also on a health side, people do not choose to die of overdoses. They do so because they can't read the strength of the opiate on their packet, because they buy it in a plastic bag of a criminal dealer. So most overdose deaths are what are called accidental poisonings, not suicides. That could be avoided if people could read the strength of their heroin on the back. Ditto, of course, with the spread of HIV and hepatitis C and other infectious diseases. This is entirely due to legislation banning drug use paraphernalia, i.e. syringes and needles and other injecting equipment. So the problems are caused by government intervention in a market economy where there is demand for a product. So the intervention was to destigmatize the user, give the user a voice and the idea that they have a right to healthcare, and provide them with the supply of clean needles, with the supply of pill testing and so on and other things. But the harm reduction discussion is actually quite shallow in itself and bland. It cannot go beyond that, beyond mitigating the harms, and this is why it has to go further. Ultimately, we need to move towards regulated drug markets, and this is where I think that, again, the two groups, when it comes to the end game, so vary, because I see with tobacco control there is another hidden agenda. The hidden agenda is very much that it's not so much just about tobacco use, public health, but it's also about social engineering, destroying large corporations, and then moving on to the next industry. Thank you.
The WHO says that 1 billion people will die in the 21st century from smoking-related diseases. Might not be accurate, but it's still a huge number. After years of tobacco policy in Europe and most of the developed world, we still have rates of smoking well over 20%. Almost everything that can be tried has been tried, and as Chris says, we're reaching sort of a point of diminishing returns. The thing that hasn't been systematically tried is finding and generalising low-risk ways of taking nicotine, the pleasurable, recreational, widely used legal drug nicotine. Finding safer ways to take that is the next big thing. I mean, that's what's on the agenda in Europe at the moment, and getting the regulatory framework right for that is the biggest issue. The Commission, European Commission, says that the directive will cut tobacco consumption by 2%. It's a trivial amount in the statistical noise. It just isn't very much. All the fuss and noise about packaging, warning and all that, that's a 2% number. Analysts in the United States on Wall Street are saying that e-cigarettes could take over or surpass consumption of cigarettes within the next 10 years. Imagine that generalised internationally, and you've got a huge inroad into that 1 billion deaths. Second point, e-cigarettes are not medicines. No matter what they say, no matter how hard they try to regulate them as medicines, they are not, they never will be. The idea fails in common sense, as Katherine will show, fails in law as well. These products are competitive consumer recreational drug products in direct competition with cigarettes for the purchasing power of the nicotine user. That's the story, that's all they are. And they need to be regulated like that, not rammed square peg into a round hole, into a regulatory framework designed for something completely different. My third point is that regulating them in this way is not just, well, actually, there's a regulatory framework, that'll do. It actually comes with costs to health. And the reason is it will raise the cost of the product, it will slow down innovation, it will reduce experimentation and creativity in the industry, it will tend to turn the marketing from exciting to boring, and it will reduce the appeal of these products to the very people who we are trying to attract to use them, that being smokers, not people who consider themselves to be patients in treatment. So forget about making a product like this 1% safer when it's already very safe. Think about the real public health agenda, which is getting the maximum number of people to switch. And you don't do that by making a product as safe and bland as possible. You make it as attractive as possible and allow powerful marketing for it. Fourth point is that there are concerns about these things. You obviously don't want products that explode in your face, blind you, poison you, break in your hands, burn you with acid or whatever. But there are perfectly good regulations that cover these risks already. Somehow we managed to get by with tens of thousands of potentially risky products on the market. Anything that uses mains electricity, anything that uses heat. These things are all covered by consumer protection regulation. We've identified about 17 directives that apply to e-cigarettes and most other products as well, to do with their safety, to do with reporting faults, to do with compensating users for faulty products, various forms of consumer protection, accurate labelling, proper weights and measures, and so on. There is a perfectly good, serviceable regulatory framework there. It just needs to be applied with some imagination and commitment and enforced properly. Job done. You don't need to recourse to medicines regulation. And my final point is this issue is creating one almighty political public health mess. The public health community is all over the place on it. As they were saying earlier, it's revealing all sorts of prohibitionist tendencies, all sorts of regulatory knee-jerk actions that all defeat the real public health objectives that these people are supposed to be working towards. The politics are getting interesting. There's now 1.3 million users of these products in the UK, and they are well organised. They have good social media, they're highly networked, and they're becoming political. They're quite different to, so if you like, AstroTurf type organisations that we've seen in the past. They are active and they are on the case, and I'm sure Rebecca will confirm this. They are on the case and they're very effective. 1.3 million users is a lot of users to ignore. For some reason, we've got quite an inspiring, sensible approach from the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives in the European Parliament, and we still have, from the coalition government, a regulatory approach here based on medicines regulation. I hope that what's been done in the European Parliament will have an influence back here, and will get the coalition, both in Europe and in London, aligned on a sensible, proportionate, reasonable, pro-health regulatory approach to this that relies on commercial freedom rather than prescription by regulators to drive this category forward. Thank you.
To follow on from what Clive was saying about medicines regulation, this is an e-cig. This is one example of an e-cig. There are many different shapes, varieties, sizes. Some of them do look like cigarettes, yes. Many of them don't. I don't think anybody would say that looks like a cigarette. The point about that is that smokers are individuals. Everybody is an individual. Everyone in this room is an individual. And certainly all smokers are individuals. And you can't give them one prescribed solution for an appealing alternative to the smoking that they are very attached to. Look at you, Angela. The point being, people don't get excited about medicines. They just don't. When did you last hear of somebody organising a patch fest to celebrate the NRT patch? It just doesn't happen. But Vape Fest is going to happen for the 4th year running this August. We're anticipating there'll be about 3,000 or 4,000 people attending. And that's grown year on year, every year, because people get excited about these things. And Clive's absolutely right to say that people are very well organised. The consumers of these products, very well organised, very well informed, very passionately dedicated to making sure that these things are not taken away from them. And that is precisely what medicines regulation would do. To turn this kind of product into a medicine, you have to break it, redesign it, start again, and at best, you can make something that's a glorified inhalator, which is deeply unsatisfying and has a huge failure rate because it's just not an appealing alternative. This is an appealing alternative. And as Chris was saying, this is a free market solution. We've seen exponential growth in this industry over the past few years. I mean, we're talking about 30% month on month during a recession, during a global recession. This is economic forces at play here that you just can't deny. Plus, you've got the massive rise in the user base. I think we're probably beyond the 1.3 million that's been estimated by Ash now. I think we're more like 1.5 million just in the UK. And that's duplicated everywhere else. You know, it's everywhere in the world. There's more and more and more vapors, whether they're banned or not, frankly. Because let's face it, laws are not going to make a blind bit of difference when people want the product as much as they do. You'll get a black market. If these things are banned, there'll be an unregulatable black market, and that would be dangerous. Because as Clive was saying, at the moment we have very good regulation from Europe, thank goodness from Europe, because we do need this centralised, so that everybody else across Europe is protected to the same extent, and so that all of those smokers have the same opportunity that we've had to find their way to this solution, because that's what it is, it's a solution. I just want to wrap up really quickly, because I know I'm tight for time, but we have now got, as an industry body, a council opinion from Sir Francis Jacob QC, who has a really, really good pedigree as a legal mind. I don't think anybody would disagree that he's someone who knows his stuff when it comes to EU law. And he has said categorically that any proposal to reclassify these as medicinal products fails on two key principles of EU law: proportionality and non-discrimination. Proportionality, because there's no need to change the regulation from what currently exists. Those 17 directives, properly applied, properly enforced, absolutely protect consumers to the extent that they need to be protected from these products. Non-discrimination, any talk of levelling the playing field between these and NRT products. You know, if you're making a medicine, you want to make a claim for it that it can treat, mitigate or prevent a disease, then yes, you have to jump through hoops because you want to make that claim. If you want to put a product on the market and not make those claims, why should you have to jump through hoops? So it's very clear that there's no legal justification for a change in the regulations, and I'm just so grateful to Rebecca and her colleagues who have bothered to inform themselves, found out the facts, and are pushing hard to get good decisions from Brussels, which can help not only the UK vapors, but also all the vapors in Spain, Portugal, Germany, Italy, everywhere at Hungary, everywhere else in Europe. We need this done right at the European level to field out to all of those member states and protect all of Europe's smokers and vapors, especially the future generations of smokers. Thank you.
I thought I'd start with a little sort of introduction as to how I ended up working on e-cigarettes as I am now. I'm a member of the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety Committee in the European Parliament. And I was actually one of the people harassing the Commission at the end of last year to release the tobacco directive. At that point I didn't know anything about electronic cigarettes, but it was more the tobacco control measures because there was a resignation of a commissioner and everything got blocked. So the tobacco directive came out, and again my focus was, I was looking for the tobacco control measures that were in there. And then I started to get contacted by, in some cases, constituents, people living in the Yorkshire and Humber region, and in some cases people just ordinary citizens who weren't specifically living in the region I represent, asking me, what is your position on e-cigarettes? And I sort of went, don't really know what they are. Let me do some reading and get back to you. So I did that, and I looked into, I read a number of papers, I got things sent to me, and then I know the medicines regulation quite well because I used to work for the European pharmacists and actually was lobbying on the pharmaceutical regulation from a community pharmacist perspective, so I know the medicines regulation quite well. And I was kind of like, how do they fit into the medicines regulation? Because the directive said that a human medicine is something which treats disease or restores physiological function. E-cigarette doesn't do that. Neither does NRT actually. And the more I looked into it, because I know the pharmaceutical regulation, and I also know how pharmacy operates. And basically, anything authorised as a medicine in a number of European countries, not in the UK, in sort of things about 20 out of 28, because we're now 28, Croatia joined a few weeks ago, can only be sold in a pharmacy. And that is assuming that the pharmacist is willing to sell them. And I spoke to my former colleagues at the European Pharmacists Association, and they said, our members, this is the national bodies of pharmacists, have said there's mixed views. So some pharmacists think, great, another way to help people move from tobacco, and something like, oh, I don't want them. So basically my bottom line is, and will remain, we cannot regulate in a way that will make e-cigarettes less available than tobacco, because from a public health perspective, this is absolutely loopy. Sorry. So what I've been doing, I've spoken to public health professors, I've spoken to Katherine and to some other people from e-cigarette companies, and I've been contacted and spoken to many users who all follow me on Twitter and send me stuff. Annoyingly, they send me stuff by Twitter, which is quite difficult to download on an iPad, so I can say, please email it to me. And basically I came together with some colleagues to try and put forward some amendments that would be a sensible way of regulating e-cigarettes, because there is a recognition, and Katherine will, and other people will be the first to say, there are some holes in the regulation. There isn't an under 18 sales ban, although obviously reputable companies do institute that. So there are a few things that sort of need tidying up, but the medicines regulation is just, I think it's a bad fit, and I think it's been, I mean, some of the vapers who follow me are convinced that this is all a big pharma industry conspiracy. I don't think it is, but if I was a pharmaceutical company, I have NRT products, e-cigarettes compete with them, I'd sure as hell want them on the same regulatory basis. Why not? I mean, I think it's a position you could absolutely expect. I don't think you could expect them to have any other position. You know. But what I think the Commission did is, A, they were under pressure to release a tobacco directive, and sorry, I was one of the people harassing them to do that, making little 1-minute speeches in Parliament. And I think rather than take the time to say, how should we do this, they went like, oh, NRT, medicines regulation, copy-paste, without really thinking, you know, so basically no work involved, because the framework already exists, the medicines agencies are there, you know, so they just sort of went, oh, push them into there. But I still remain unconvinced that that's the best way to go. We did lose the vote, unfortunately, last week in the Environment Committee. It was, I think, 45-27 or something like that, for the amendment that I had tabled with some others. There were 2 amendments, basically 2 competing amendments on Article 18, which is the one that regulates e-cigarettes, and the one which took the medicines route was adopted. But that's not the end, because it also has to go through the whole Parliament, because often what we do with uncontroversial pieces of legislation, I've worked on something on cross-border health threats, basically better coordination when you've got pandemic influenza. This is not politically sensitive, it's just very sensible, and that basically went straight to plenary as a single vote. We basically went into negotiations with the member states, with the national governments first, and then brought it to Parliament and then through. This will not happen with the tobacco directive. It will go to plenary and then go into negotiation with national governments, because it's too politically sensitive otherwise. That it needs to come with a strong Parliament mandate. So it's not over, because we hope, as in me and several colleagues, our shadow, who's a lady called Frederick Rees, a Belgian Liberal, my colleague Chris Davis, who I think a couple of you have mentioned, and we also hope to work with some colleagues from other political groups who are sort of like-minded on this issue, to try to come up with, so maybe slightly reword the amendment that failed last week, sort of rework it a little bit and see if we can get something where we can get much broader support. I've no worries that we can't get the 40 MEPs to sign it, to put it to the plenary. It's a question of getting it through. So we'll see how that goes. And I leave it there. Thank you.